Imagine if the same way cigarettes have to have the Surgeon General warning that cigarettes cause cancer, if like social media platforms had to have a notification that pops up whenever you log in that says, warning, social media can lead to loneliness and division.
You are listening to Loneliness Busters, a podcast where I talk to founders, researchers, policymakers, investors, community builders, and more on how to build a more connected world. I hope you join the squad. We need all hands on deck now more than ever. Hi, everyone. I am excited to have David Spinks today with us. David is the author of the book Business of Belonging. He is co-founder of CMX, a 20,000 strong member organization dedicated to helping community professionals. Until recently, David was the VP of Community at Bevy, an enterprise events platform. David launched his first online community when he was just 14 years old for his favorite video game. Today, he's a prominent leader in the community-driven business movement and has advised many companies, including Facebook, Google, Udemy, Waze, and Airbnb. I ended up in the CMX conference this October by pure chance and serendipity and was impressed by his talk on engineering serendipity. So here we are. David, it's a pleasure to have you on the pod and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be serendipitously connected.
Yes, isn't it beautiful when this happens? Awesome. Let's dive right in. Let's start from the beginning. Tell us your story. Tell us where you come from and what made you a community builder.
Yeah. So I was born in New York in Long Beach, a small barrier island off of Long Island. And so not the California one, not to be confused. And both my parents were immigrants. So my dad was born in Ireland, grew up in England. My mom was born and raised in Israel. They met in Israel, moved to the US, and I was born a year later. The experience of community, or lack thereof, that I had from birth pretty much was being a part of a small family. Most of our family lives in other countries. So small family here in the US, building our community from the ground up. Of course, as a baby, you don't recognize that. Your reality is the only reality. But now looking back, you start to see the threads that led me to do community work later on was how much hard work my parents had to put into building their community from the ground up and to build my community for me as well. And it wasn't always easy. I dealt with things a lot of men deal with at young ages around bullying and violence. As a Jew with an Israeli mother, I dealt with a lot of anti-Semitism. Even the Jews would make fun of me for being more Jewish. I had a wonderful childhood, great parents, great family. I had good friends at various times, but I also had a lot of falling outs with friends and challenges that made me feel really lonely at a really young age. You mentioned Tony Hawk. That was probably my introduction to the world of digital community. I was in middle school. A friend of mine locally and I used to play all the time. We became really obsessed with it. We became pretty good. We started playing online, hosting. We ended up starting a clan together. And that clan grew and turned into an online community that ended up being one of the most popular online communities for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. And so I was 14, I think, at the time, and managing a community with trolls and contests and spam and deep conversations and conflict and all the things that community managers manage today. And that kind of introduced me to this world of digital community. And since then, I've been very comfortable with talking to strangers online, but building community online, and became really fascinated with how social media and social platforms would change the way we connect. I got really excited about that in the early days, and now I have a more nuanced view of it. And that ultimately led to a career in community. I went to school for business administration, started connecting dots in my own mind of, all right, it seems like all of this stuff is moving online. Community is growing online. Businesses are trying to connect with customers, and that's where they're spending time. That's where I put all my focus. So my first job out of college was a community manager, which is really rare at the time. This was 2009. Community manager wasn't a title that was very often given or recognized. And that set me off down a career of working in community, started a project called the Community-Manager.com with Jen Peety and Brett Petersell. That was one of the first communities for community managers that ultimately led and served as a foundation for launching CMX, which is a conference for community managers. And I did that for 8 years. I stepped down a year ago. It's been going for 9 years. It's had over 14 conferences, I think now. And yeah, pretty much started some random startups and other companies throughout that experience as well. But community has always been the thread. And so, yeah, now today I'm a writer. I write a newsletter. I wrote a book called The Business of Belonging. And I do consulting with businesses, teaching them how to build community, while I'm also in a bit of a career transition myself. And like you, I'm exploring a lot of these topics more broadly around human connection and loneliness, reading a lot of the research on it, trying to write what I'm learning, and just seeing where that takes me.
That's such a beautiful story. A lot of people I've talked to who are in this space have very common threads across building community in childhood, having a pivotal moment sometime in their life where they recognize it's the most important thing. And it's a profession where you do work with your heart and mind both at the same time. And so tell me a little bit about what drew you to write this book, Business of Belonging. At some level, it sounds like an oxymoron. I haven't heard the word belonging in I've spent over a decade in lots of companies, right? And it's not a word that is thrown around. Even in the marketing world, it's not a word that is thrown around very frequently. So tell me a little bit about what drew you to write the book, and what do you think is the role of business in battling the crisis of loneliness, social disconnection, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, the book was an attempt to collect everything I had learned from the over a decade of experience I had at that point, building community for business, training a whole lot of companies, developing education programs. I wanted to put together a simple guide that someone who's interested in getting into this kind of work you can hand it to them and it'll give them a good lay of the land. It's basically the book I wish that I had when I started working in community for businesses. The title always excited me because of that tension. Business and belonging almost feels like an oxymoron, yes, but there's a tension there. It's almost a clash. It's an active oxymoron, right? They're not just opposites. They're almost opposing forces that are pushing against each other. And having worked in this space for a very long time, that tension has become so apparent to me. And it's a part of every conversation I have with a business or a community manager, this push between the human and the capitalistic, the need for profit and the need to truly give people a space of belonging and connection. And I think we've reached this point in capitalism or business culture where there's such a call for businesses to be impact driven and to have a purpose and to have a set of values, and adopting all of these very human centric concepts and terminology with very good intentions and very good reason. But what I'm starting to see is the flip side of that coin, where now people are relying on businesses to provide them with a sense of belonging and purpose and values that we really shouldn't be relying on businesses to provide. Because a business is a community. We use the word community to describe everything these days, from family to fan clubs, sports teams, intimate support groups, every kind of group. You can call it a community. And a business is a specific kind of community built on the structure of a corporation, and a corporation is just an agreement. It's a piece of paper that says, here are the rules for how we are going to work together, and the one purpose of that agreement, of that piece of paper, is to make money. And it's a rule that businesses have to live by. Even nonprofits, right? It has to have more money in the bank account than it's spending, right? And the minute that truth no longer becomes true, a business has to make sacrifices. It has to have layoffs. It has to pivot its product. It has to change the customers that it's focusing on. If somebody is not a good fit for a business because they're not performing or for any other reason that it's just clear they're not going to be successful there, they may get fired. So yes, it's a kind of community, but it's a kind of community where overnight it could disappear. And all that purpose, all that identity, all that social connection, all that belonging that you put in it is now gone. That to me is a core part of the problem we're seeing today, where people are putting all of their belonging eggs in the baskets of business, when in reality, if we can look at business as a specific kind of community, and so don't tie your entire self-worth and your sense of purpose to this one company, right? Make sure it's aligned with your values, make sure it's aligned with your purpose, but don't draw so much of it that if it were to disappear, you would actually feel like you lose yourself. And when we build community in a business, absolutely, we should still focus on belonging in the context of, does everyone here feel safe to use their voice? Does everybody feel like they have access to the right information and people? Do they feel like they can be effective at collaborating with each other? All of those are really good, important things of a business community, but you're not going to, say, have employees process their trauma in a business context, right? So that's the kind of questions I'm asking a lot right now is what kind of experiences or community experiences are right to be facilitated within the context of a business today? And what kinds of community experiences should we not be trying to hold in a business today? And actually, a business, if they really want to help their employees become more socially healthy, would encourage their employees to find that sense of connection and belonging and community in other places like their family, their friends, their neighborhood, their hobbies, other kinds of spaces that are built for that kind of connection and will not be removed from them overnight if it's not a fit.
That's a really interesting point of view, which is what's the right fit of scope of community for business versus other areas of your life. I think more and more in the last decade or so, most portion of our waking hours have been consumed by for-profit companies. Most people work in a for-profit company in the world, and then you come back. Of course, the time spent in third places has gone down. You spend more and more time in social media. You also have reduced the amount of time you go to shop or go for grocery shopping. Like there's one-click buys, and you just disintermediated a lot of spaces that, for example, that you talk about when you talk about engineering serendipity. Like what are those spaces where people just bump into each other? And those have gone down. And it's an interesting question on, does business take a step back and let the other areas flourish? Or does business rethink about how they extract value from community? Or are there areas in businesses in which the two are not in conflict with each other? Tell me, you've studied this more than anyone I know. Can you tell us examples of businesses where belonging is good for them, where there is a symbiotic relationship between it being good for profit and also being good for the customers or users that they serve?
Yeah. And so there's a couple framings that I think are useful. One is there's two different kinds of companies that I often talk about and work with. So I call it either a community-centric company or a community-peripheral company. Community-centric means the product is a community. You can look at something like Chief is a really popular company that's growing a ton right now, valued at over $1 billion. And it's a community for female executives to be able to have these smaller curated discussion groups, coaching programs, pretty much like an association or a professional community to support women who are at those high levels, right? In those cases, it's more obvious where belonging plays a role, right? The product is basically the value that the product provides is this network. It's this connection. It's the way those connections are facilitated. And so community is an obvious fit for the business and aligns. There's no question of what's the value of community in that context. It's the product. It is the value. Community peripheral, which is most companies, are where you have a product, which could be anything from a laptop to a bottle of Coca-Cola to clothing that you wear. And then the business will build community around that product for people who are fans of that product or customers of that product or potential customers of that product. And that's where it gets a lot harder to balance that tension, because you need community to drive value to some part of the business, which ultimately means money, sales, retention, reducing support costs. Maybe you're collecting feedback to improve the product. We use a framework that the CMX team developed together a long time ago that's become quite popular in the space, called the Spaces model. So that stands for support, like support forums where customers are answering questions for each other. Product, you're collecting feedback. Acquisition, so community is helping acquire new customers. Contribution, so it's a platform, let's say like an Airbnb, where the members are actually contributing what makes the product, the content that makes the platform. E is for engagement, so essentially like customer retention. By building community, are people retained for a longer time? And then success, can we connect our customers to each other and help them teach each other how to better use our product or how to grow in their career? So those are like the frameworks for structuring it. And there are good examples. The Salesforce Trailblazer program is a really popular example in the space. They've built a really large community team. They've tens or hundreds of thousands of members now who are all trailblazers, who are their customers, who are actively learning and teaching each other and supporting each other. They do big events, things like that. Duolingo was a really good example of a company that invested in community really thoughtfully as they grew. First, their Duolingo's an app where you can learn any language, and most of their first courses were all developed in collaboration with their community. So if you spoke Spanish and English, you could raise your hand and say, I can help contribute to that course, and people would. And then, of course, once you learn a language on Duolingo, you want to practice it. So they started empowering their members to self-organize local events where they could practice their language. At one point, they were hosting, I think it was over 2,000 events a week, all by empowering community members to self-organize. And that was a really powerful experience as well. And there are examples where, yes, there's a lot of community elements. It's very social, it's very connected, and they're empowering members to self-organize and create their own community experiences. And they're doing so in a way that is very clearly driving some sort of value for the business. Those are two examples. The challenge, I think, for a lot of businesses is that, especially at early stages, you're like so much in survival mode that you have to you have to be making money. You have to be constantly focused on growth. And community is a very long-term play. And even if you know what the business value is, tying connection, like belonging, do people feel connected to each other in a community, tying that with data to how did this impact our bottom line is really difficult. And so a lot of the time what you'll find are companies that are more established and have a lot more financial security can invest in more community programs that are very long-term and loosely connected to revenue, whereas companies that are very growth-driven have less of that flexibility and just are forced to think a bit too short-term for community to really work.
Is that something that you see changing? I ask because the last few months I've heard this term called community-led growth versus product-led growth
Mm-hmm.
quite a few times. As of course the conversations around Substack and Notion and Airtable and all of these sort of new age productivity tools, which are mostly the sales team are basically their customers, right?
Yeah, it's hard. Like you look at something like Notion or Airtable, they're a little bit of anomalies. People love their product so much. Actually, I advised the Notion team before they actually built their community program and their community team. And I remember sitting down with Camille and Ben, who were getting started on those programs, and they're like, "Yeah, we're trying to figure out what we should do." And they were and I was like, "All right, how's the community looking so far? What's happened organically?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, the community started this subreddit, and it's already got tens of thousands of members in it, and they're all hyper active. And also, people started hosting events all over the world, and we're trying to figure out how to get that operationalized and support that." And so I was just like, "Oh my God, like you already have this massive, thriving organic community. What you're trying to figure out right now is how to operationalize it, how to support it, how to enhance it, how to make it better. That is so not the problem that most companies have. I'd say 99.999% of companies are like, how do we get people to start communities? How do we get people to start events? And if you don't have a product that just has this cult following that formed around it very organically, like Notion did, it's really hard. It's not something you can force. Are things changing? I think everyone has that aspiration. And if you want to do that, then do what Notion did, which is just be relentlessly focused on improving your product. Like, it took Notion a really long time to find product market fit. It took them years. I think they were an example where they didn't even launch their product for a long time because they were just very quietly and privately building and building and building and talking to customers and watching how they're using it and just staying razor focused on making the product better, to the point where it became so good that people really just felt like it changed their life and it was a big game changer for them. In the world of business, I think falling into the trap of we can build a product and then we can hire a community team to build a community around it and get people really excited about our product, I think is a myth. I think if you don't have a product that people are already really excited about and really reliant on and use it every day or use it often in their work or in their life, it's going to be really hard to build a community around it. You can't force people to feel a sense of connection to your brand or your product. That can only happen naturally.
Talk to us about how can businesses think about increasing their probability of building a thriving community, given that hopefully they have a product that people want.
Yeah, you have two options, right? You can build it around your product, and if people love your product, then great. Or you can build it around an identity that's related to your product, right? Culture Amp is a company that sells software to people, professionals, HR professionals, people who manage internal employee resources, those kinds of things. And they launched a community in a conference called Culture First, which isn't just for their customers, it's for anybody who's working in culture and people. And there's a lot of really good examples like that now. HubSpot's Inbound was a really big success story around that, where they tried to create a professional identity of the inbound marketer at the really early days of their product, right? Maybe even before the product had really strong product market fit. And so I think there's always an opportunity to build belonging, and a company can start building community at any point, even before they have a product, because what you're essentially doing is building the community of people that you want to use your product. And if you can host a community space, and that can be a space where you're learning and listening and engaging deeply in conversation with these people, maybe that's how you end up with a Notion-like product with a cult-like following. Because you have to have a culture of just being so obsessive about helping people, about solving their problem in the best way possible. I think companies rush to figure out sales and marketing and growth and look at community as a growth engine before they look at it as a learning tool. I think that's probably what I would say is the best thing to do, is look at community in the early days as a learning tool until you can't stop people from wanting to use your product because it's that good and people are really trying to bang your door down.
What you're saying is community is not just for selling your products, it's for building your products, and it's for building your products in a way that people would love it, enjoy it. So we talked a little bit about how people can start communities in businesses, either social identity around products. Say you have a dormant community. How do you create a space or an experience or avenues for them to actually grow into a more invested community and help each other? Are there structured interventions that businesses can do?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One is just always start small. Even if you've had a community that's really large and it went dormant, like it's no longer active, the goal isn't to try to get all 1,000 people to be active again. The goal is to get the 10 right people to be active and really find value and to start showing up regularly. because 10 really active, true believers can power an entire community of hundreds or thousands of people, right? If the 10 people at the core are really committed, really engaged, really connected to each other. If you're starting a brand new community, same thing. Don't try to get 1,000 people in there at once. Try to get the right 10 people. And what that also allows you to do is experiment. And that's the way I see all communities, as an ongoing experiment where you form a hypothesis. I believe that this group of people who share this identity will want to connect with each other in this way in order to achieve some outcome, right? That's always the framework of any community. And so you form your hypothesis and then you test it. I believe that moms in my local community are going to want to come together over breakfast every Wednesday to be able to make friends with people in a format where they're not allowed to talk about their kids, because that's all we ever talk about at any parent event, for the outcome of forming deeper relationships with other women in their community, right? Okay, that's my theory. Great. Let me host 4 breakfasts over the next 2 months and collect that feedback and be really present with that experience. And maybe each Wednesday I try different icebreakers or try a slightly different format for how to facilitate it until it clicks, right? Just like a product, until you have community member fit, where people are like, this was incredible. When is the next one? I want to sign up right now. Great. You're onto something really powerful. The survey responses you get back are all 10 out of 10. Great. You have something really powerful. And now you build on that. You give it a name. You start to maybe host it in other places, and you can start, once you have something that works, then you start figuring out how do you replicate that model, assuming your goal is scale. If your goal is scale and you want to have a really large community, now you can do 1,000 of those breakfasts in cities all over the country. If it's not scale, maybe you just wanted that for your own local community and you just want that for yourself. Great. Just keep hosting that breakfast, and that's a really meaningful community in your life now. If it doesn't work, that's great too. You learn something that doesn't work. You cut that hypothesis. It was a failure, and you try something else.
You said something even in the conference talk, doing things with authenticity means that you do things that don't scale, handwritten notes, etc., etc. What does this mean for the cost of running a community for a business? If you do things that don't scale, how does that work?
Yeah. So for a business, that's part of this tension of business and belonging, is that scale is always the desired outcome, especially when you're focused on growth. Like, every business is trying to get more customers who will spend more, and they may be doing that in the most humane way possible, in the most positive, impactful way possible, but their goal is still going to be to grow. And so for community, that's a challenge, both because community is rarely something that will grow fast. It can, right? Some communities take off like wildfire, but a lot of communities start really small and intimate and only very gradually grow. And it could take a long time. So for a company, when we talk about doing things that don't scale, what you're basically saying is, we know one day our goal is to have this impact at scale, but we recognize that it's going to take a long time to reach that inflection point where we can actually scale this up. Our goal in the short run, which in the short run for community could still mean 12 months, 18 months, is to build the foundation of a community, do things that don't scale, be extremely personal and hands-on. Like, when you're starting a community, you should be personally inviting every single member with a completely custom email, right? Maybe even get on the phone with the first 25 people one-on-one before you even invite them, right? That's stuff that you can't do at 1,000 people, but you can absolutely do it at 10 people, at 20 people, right? Really good example of that is Nextdoor is a platform for you to connect with your neighbors. It's present in almost every city and every community in the country, in the USA today. And the way they started was with one town. And they literally went to door to people's homes and had them sign like a petition, basically, to say that they were interested in being on this platform. And then they went to the town hall and they presented it to the community, right? So, like, super as hands on the street as it gets, to figure out how to make one town work. And then once it worked there, Then they launched a second one. And there they were still extremely hands-on. And slowly over time, they started to innovate and invent ways that they can onboard and set up a new community to be successful without needing to physically be there themselves and without needing to go door to door. But they needed to first figure out, do we even have something that's valuable here? We need to do things that don't scale to just get this one community on the platform and start learning about this experience before we start thinking about 10 or 100 or 1,000.
What that brings to mind for me is this concept of resilience, which is communities take time to scale, but also community give you resilience if your business is going up and down, right? Customers are going to give you a lot more leeway and will forgive mistakes you did if you have built that relationship with them. I think it's interesting as we had more and more VC-led companies in the last couple of decades, the amount of patient capital in the world has gone down. Everybody wants to go from zero to a unicorn or decacorn or whatever the new terminology is in a year, 2 years, 3 years. If you look at the most resilient communities, and I take the example of religion all the time for this, biggest marketing campaign in the world and anchored around human flourishing and community, took hundreds of years to build, but has taken thousands and thousands of years to actually sustain. And it's even now when we say it's eroding, it's still omnipresent in majority of people's life. And this idea around building unicorns versus building companies that last, it's an interesting case study to ponder on. Do communities actually build resilience? And I think you're right. It comes naturally to companies that are of a certain scale to be able to invest for resilience. When you're in the early stages of your survival, you're not thinking about resilience. You're thinking about survival. So,
right.
Yeah.
And look, like, it's okay. Going back to the first point we talked about, it's okay that a startup that's going for rapid growth isn't building this like deep, fulfilling, meaningful, emotional community space. The problem is that was an expectation in the first place, right? But if they're like, hey, like, we're a startup, if you like tinkering on new products and like being an early adopter and playing with this stuff, great. We're going to connect you with other people who also like doing that and who are interested in what we're building. We're going to be really hands-on with you, and we're going to listen to your feedback. We commit to listening and applying your feedback to our product when it makes sense. You get to be involved at this early stage. If all of this resonates with you, great. Like, we'd love to have you in our community. We'd like to connect you with each other. We'd like to have you involved in this program. But like the unsaid thing is, we wouldn't recommend coming here if this is where you're coming to like address a deep sense of loneliness and you're searching for really meaningful connection with other people. You might find that through here, but we're not facilitating the kinds of conversations that necessarily open up deep, meaningful connection. That's not the purpose of this community. The purpose of this is to have fun on this like new project and be playful and tinker together. So I think a lot of it's about those expectations around when we use the word community, what do we mean? What kind of community? What kind of connection? What kind of impact do we want that community to have?
My initial thought as you were talking about it goes back to social media, where, to be honest, like, there is so much data now on the kind of mental health issues that are being caused by social media. Of course, it is also very useful in a lot of contexts. If you're a content creator, if you want to get a community around an interest, etc., etc. If there's a disaster in a country and you want to rally resources, there are lots of good use cases for social media. But it is a broadcasting platform. It is not a one-on-one platform where you build deep relationships, right? However, I haven't heard most of these social media companies come out and say, do not use us for this, right? Or that this data exists that if you use it in a certain way, it might not be good for your health. There is not a lot of self-awareness and or appetite because it's not good for business to say that. You would want your users to use your product no matter what, right? Eventually, if your sole purpose is profit. So yeah, you're right. I think there is an inherent conflict between business and belongingness.
You just gave me a thought of imagine if the same way cigarettes have to have the Surgeon General warning that cigarettes cause cancer, if like social media platforms had to have a notification that pops up whenever you log in that says, warning, social media can lead to loneliness and division. Like maybe it gets to that point in the future where, unlike cigarettes, there are positive impacts of social media, but whether these companies choose to be accountable and transparent to the negative impact or they're forced to, I think for us to really put a dent in loneliness, there needs to be a lot of conversations happening around how do we teach people how to use these platforms in a healthy way? How do we create better standards and restrictions around them? It's hard to just keep seeing it go down the path it's on and affect people the way it is. And there's very little accountability around it.
Yeah. I have a few fun questions before we close out.
Fun questions in a loneliness podcast.
Yes, this is my true belief that the antidote of loneliness is actually curiosity, play, fun, and connection. I think we have created a world where we work too hard and we don't play enough.
I agree.
And it's important. Play is one of the most powerful animal trait for people to let go, de-stress, and really have fun with each other. Yeah, this is a loneliness podcast and we have fun here.
Good answer.
Awesome. So tell me, what is your favorite social connection ritual?
I'm in a unique place in my life right now because I stepped down from my company a year ago. I moved across the country with my family back to New York. We just had our second kid, and I don't have a lot of social connection with as many friends in the broader community. I'm still building that community up. But I think a lot of my social connection revolves around my kids these days and watching them turn into humans and watching how they interact with the world and watching them grow. And then just the daily moments of picking them up from school and having them run into your arms and hug you. It's those little moments that have really grounded me in a way that I grew up being highly extroverted. I'm definitely a people pleaser. I've put way too much of my own self-worth in the thoughts of others in the past. And I feel like I'm reaching a phase in my life where I'm feeling a lot more grounded in myself and in my family and in those like little moments rather than needing to crave it from all these like different random people.
That's beautiful. I think I'm also on this journey because I became a mother. There's something so pure about the connection you have with your kid. And when I'm with her, I forget everything. I don't remember who I am, what I am, what I'm stressed about during the day. It just disappears because that's why also play is important. I think they know how to be in the moment.
I was just going to say that talking about play, have kids. I've never played so much in my life. I'm on the floor constantly now.
Yeah, isn't it? It's called rough and tumble play. I do that all the time. It might look like wrestling to other people, but we are having fun. That's awesome. Any message to other loneliness busters out there who are seeking to create a more connected world through business or otherwise?
You and I were talking about this earlier before we started the podcast, but I'm just learning through my research into loneliness and human connection just how intersectional the problem is, how complex it is, and how there's so many different avenues to solve this problem, whether it's from a healthcare perspective, from a regulation perspective, from community building. Like I spent most of my career focused on community building with the idea that, yeah, trying to combat loneliness. And as more and more recently, I'm realizing that community is just one sliver of the problem. How do you educate people on how to connect with people more effectively? There's a really awesome podcast, an author named Vanessa Van Edwards. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She teaches people simple things like how to smile, how to interact, how to pick up on nonverbal cues, just how to hold a conversation, how to have charisma, just like the real, most tactical version of teaching people how to connect with each other. And I'm the type of person that likes to play in all the fields and see the big picture. I like to read the research and watch the trends, but also understand that like tactical stuff. But I think there's room for all of it. There's people who are going to get really tactical, very, very hands-on. Also, just the way we show up in our lives is a huge impact, and the ripple effects it has from just how you as a person treat one other person. That's just as important in my mind as studying loneliness across millions of people and trying to find trends and change policy. All of it has a place in here. I think a large part of what's going to make this change is going to be cultural, and that really just happens one interaction at a time.
Thank you for making this interaction so meaningful. So, one conversation at a time. I hope we've moved the needle in some way in this universe. Thanks again for coming. And I hope this is one of many conversations we have.
I hope so too. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me and that you're leading these conversations and bringing all of those disparate parts that we just talk about into one space where we can all learn to together. So just a lot of gratitude for you and the work you're doing here.
If you're still here, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend who you think should join the Loneliness Busters squad. See you next time.